Welcome everyone to our first Hot Topics webinar. I'm Kate Golby. I'm a Senior Behavioural Analyst here at GRIST and your MC today. Joining me are three of my colleagues here at GRIST: Insights and Innovation Manager, Stacey Makshakova, our Managing Director, Peter Grist, and Director, Caitlin Ziegler. Now, today's conversation, we're going to focus on future skills, looking at what's driving the change, what skills are absolutely necessary for the future of the workforce here in Australia, and how you and your organisation can best be equipped to embrace the change and to thrive. We'll get into our discussion in just a moment, but first I'll just take you through a little bit of housekeeping. So today we invite you to ask questions to any of our panelists, and the best way to do this is either via the chat or the Q&A function in the control panel there. So either of those two icons will get you the ability to ask us questions, and please ask at any time. I'll be monitoring these throughout and I'll butt in and ask the questions for you. Okay, so now a little bit about our panelists. For those of you who have joined some of our previous tactical coaching masterclass webinars, these faces may be familiar to you. Stacey Makshakova is an accomplished researcher with qualifications in commerce and psychology. She brings an intuitive understanding of the human mind with robust intellectual curiosity to her role here at GRIST. She loves working with clients who challenge the status quo and while placing their customers at the heart of everything that they do. And Peter Grist has more than 20 years experience working with customer-focused organisations with the aim of improving coaching and leadership capability. Peter's action-oriented mindset is one of the reasons clients love working with him, and his preference for solving problems and making a difference to the lives of people who he works with has kept him with GRIST since the early days. All right, it's time to get into it, so I'll hand you over to our moderator for today, Caitlin Ziegler.
Thank you, Kate, and thanks Stacey and Peter for joining us for this conversation. I'm going to get straight into it. I thought it would be really good to start by asking you, Peter, why we at GRIST decided to undertake this research and talk about future skills. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
The old classic being on mute. Caitlin, thanks for the question. At GRIST, our purpose is to help clients simplify, change and inspire learning. And in our roles doing that, we're obviously talking to a lot of our clients, and there is no doubt that there's a growing concern within amongst our clients around this concept of change fatigue and the amount of change that's actually coming down the line and how organisations adapt. And then when you put that together with, I think there's a great quote by Justin Trudeau, the Canadian Prime Minister, where he says that, you know, the rate of change has never been this fast, but it'll never be this slow again. So we're already fatigued, but we're facing into a period of even greater change. And anyone that's seen ChatGPT and AI coming down the line would sort of understand that feeling of increasing the rate of change. And then you also look at, you know, even the Australian government is quite worried about this particular issue. Claire O'Neill, who's the Home Affairs Minister, she recently made a speech about changes to immigration, and one of the things she said was that we're facing the greatest labour shortage in Australia since World War II. And perhaps she could have been a little bit more eloquent, but she said the words, "We need to skill up or sink." So I think when, and then you add that to COVID, so over the last few years, while many of the people that were working together in offices have had to go and work from home, and for organisations, that's taken away many of the activities and the ways that they would normally develop capability inside their organisation. So we're facing into this place where we need to change more quickly than ever. And we're coming from 3 or 4 years of, or at least 3 years of unproductive learning. So we had a gut feeling and a hunch that we are facing into a problem, and that organisations are not aware of the problem or as aware as what they need to. So we thought, well, rather than just relying on anecdotal evidence and what our hunch is, why don't we go and actually have a look at what the research says? And so that was why we decided to go ahead with this piece of work.
Right. Thank you, Peter. There's a lot of things coming at us, right? It's a lot to be dealing with already without even thinking about that future. But Stacey, you really took the lead on this research, and we would love to understand just what the trends were that you saw that will affect our work in the future. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yes, absolutely. So I looked into the research that was done in Australia and also internationally. And what I saw that there were two major trends that were affecting our job and skill situation. So one is a global trend, and you're all very familiar with it, and that's technology and automation. So the latest data by World Economic Forum says that by 2027, almost 43% of tasks that we are performing currently will be done by machine. So that's a huge, huge proportion. Wow. I have to say that there is a bit of good news here, that in Australia, we are better positioned than any other developed countries to withstand the forces coming from the automation, and we're at lower risk of losing jobs to automation. And this is because many other occupations in the Australian economy, they depend on the tasks and skills that are not that easy to automate. So that's one side of the story. The other one is, and that relates to the immigration problem that Peter just mentioned. And in Australia and countries like Australia, we have a challenge that's coming from an aging population. So that means that we are getting more and more people over the age of 65. So, and it is, of course, not a problem in and of itself. It's a good thing when people are living longer and healthier lives. But the challenge here is that when this growth is not compensated by the growth in the younger population, what you get is fewer people of working age, and we somehow need to get those people from somewhere. So, and that, I guess, leads to that immigration challenge that we're facing at the moment.
Yeah, it makes sense. Why you can see then where that panic comes from. It's like that demographic change, smaller pool of workforce, and these massive changes we need to reskill for. I'd love to just home in on that automation and AI, because I think that is something that we're all quietly worried about. I mean, any news article you look at, every second news article I feel like mentions ChatGPT. So tell me a little bit about what skills you saw in that research that would be needed, given that we're facing in those sort of huge challenges from automation and AI.
Yeah, I would say that first thing that it's not all doom and gloom. There are lots of skills that we will need that are typically human skills. And consistently in all of the research papers that I was looking in, there were 3 categories of skills that we will need in the future. So one is data and digital skills. And I know it's natural to think that probably that relates only to those highly specialized type of skills like AI, machine learning, and data science, data analysis. That's true, of course, but it also relates to our basic digital skills, our ability to interact with technology. And that shouldn't be ignored as well, because it is anticipated that in the future, we will be spending more time interacting with technology than we ever before. And recently I saw a research that said that in Australia, in some industries like health industries and transport and retail, people there will be spending 75% more time using their basic digital skills than they did, let's say, a few years ago. So that's a massive uplift. The other category of skills that we will need relates to higher order cognitive skills. So that is our ability to solve complex problems, think analytically, and think critically. And you know that in the environment that's constantly changing, where the goals that you need to achieve are not very well defined, complex problem solving will be the tool that will allow you to achieve those kind of goals. And with critical thinking, you know that with the lots of information around us, and especially information that can be generated with ChatGPT, it's really important to use critical thinking and analyze information, appraise information, and make sound judgments based on that. And finally, the third category, which is very near and dear to our hearts, and that is social influence and communication. So research suggests that skills like leadership, influence, persuasion, communication will be extremely important going forward.
That is sort of music to our ears, I'm sure, Stacey, and it is something very close to our hearts, definitely. But tell me a little bit more about that with the communication skills. Why will they become so important?
Look, one side of the story is that we are using their skills now, and they are not easily automated. So the machines are not going to take over those tasks that require us communicating and collaborating with each other. They can definitely help, but they're not going to take it completely over from us. And the second reason is that it is anticipated that we will be spending more time on communication collaboration than we did in the past. So research by National Skills Commission showed that if you order all those skills and how much time you spend on the skills, you will see that communication comes up at the top too, by how much more time we'll be spending each week on doing the tasks that involve communication.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. You can't really imagine that we would spend more time communicating. It feels like we do a lot, but I know that's something it's such a valuable skill to have when you do it well. Thank you, Stacey. That's really interesting research. Peter, I'd love to hear your thoughts on what this actually means for organisations then.
Thanks, Caitlin. Well, the very obvious implication for organisations is the skills that they've got today and not the skills that they're going to need tomorrow. And that organisations need to understand that this is a huge risk to their ability to achieve their strategic objectives, and that this is a risk that needs to be managed at the highest level in organisations, just like any other critical business risk is managed. So, you know, workplace health and safety, sovereign risk, compliance risk, they're all managed by boards and exec teams. But, you know, skills shortages are not something that makes it up to that level. So what we see is for many organisations in the future, a key point of strategic advantage will be their ability to reskill their current workforce, because as Stacey has pointed out, you won't be able to just go and grab these workers just from anywhere, just, you know, coming out of universities with all these skills magically. It's best that you actually keep the people you've got, and as roles change, and AI and automation makes some roles redundant, we're really good at reskilling those people into those jobs of the future. Now, this actually then takes, and to do it at the speed required, takes a fundamental rethink of the way organisations go about change and capability development. So it's quite profound, the impact it'll have.
Yeah, gosh, that's really is a big challenge that's got really far-reaching implications for organisations and their people. But so, Peter, you're the expert in sort of organisational development and change management. Where would you recommend that organisations start addressing this challenge?
Yeah, I think it's what we need to realise that this is going to be a fundamental change to organisations. And when you're talking about fundamental change, it's always best that ideally that starts right at the top. So, you know, if you look at boards and exec teams, they're generally pretty good at putting forward a strategy. So we would say that in the future, not only do you need to put forward a strategy, but you also need to put forward an audit of how the skills that you've got now align with the skills that you're going to need in the future, and that you have as a key part of your strategy at the highest level in the organisation, you have a plan of attack that specifically addresses those skills that you need, because there's little point having a strategy if you don't have the skills to execute it. So we believe that this needs to be right up there on the risk register with organisations. So that would be one of the first places to start.
Yeah, that's interesting. So mentioning that you think that addressing this future skills challenge would best start from the top. We know that doesn't always happen, that it's easier said than done. So what could be done at other levels in organisations to start addressing this now?
Yeah, I think you're right. We don't always get perfect alignment from top to bottom inside organisations, and we don't want that to stop us from even starting. So I think the best way to answer this question is to start thinking about this concept of a learning culture. So this is a culture where learning and skills attainment is valued just as highly as any other objective in the organisation. And, you know, it's not training, development, getting better at what you do. Is not something that you do just when all of your work is done. And it's certainly not something that's done by a 30-minute tick and flick e-learn that we all know that we've done a few of in our time.
Yes, everyone's experienced those ones, I'm absolutely sure. So that's interesting, a learning culture. And I'd love you to dive a little bit more deeply into that, Peter, if you could. What is a learning culture?
Well, learning, as I said before, a learning culture is one that truly values learning and puts that right up at the top of their priority list. So the first element I'd say is that a learning culture, and when I say learning culture, I don't necessarily talk about learning culture across a whole organisation. I'm even talking about learning culture in an individual team. So if we understand this, you know, if there's leaders on the call today, they could actually start working on some of this stuff immediately within their teams. So the first thing you've got to be good at all levels really is to understand the gap in skills that you're trying to address. Yeah, that's one of the first things. And to make sure that we're absolutely clear about the change in behaviour that we're actually looking for from our people, because it's pretty hard to train and develop people if we don't know the skills that we're actually looking for. The next point I'd sort of point out around a learning culture is organisations that are good at this have a really good understanding of where learning really occurs. So there's a really strong learning and development theory called 70-20-10. And what that tells us is that 90% of learning actually happens on the job while we're applying and working with the support of, say, our leaders and our peers as well. Now, most traditional learning basically ignores that 90% and just focuses on this 10% of the more formal learning. So that's why we think that this requires a fundamental rethink, because the way we're currently doing learning development and capability change was built for another time, and it's just not going to be quick enough to keep up. So what we need to do is harness the power of that 90% of learning. That means that we might have a chance of actually getting the skills we need in the future.
Great. Have you got an example of that? Something, you know, how that sort of differs from what we might be more used to in terms of a learning culture from school?
Yeah, well, yes, it's a good way of thinking about it. Everyone on this call has been to school, and some of us may have been to university, but you know, think about those endless tasks and assignments that you had to undertake, and it was all about applying learning for the sake of learning. And so what that makes is it's pretty hard to find the motivation, and obviously you want to do it because you want the degree or you want the qualification, but at the time it's pretty hard to see what's the point of actually doing it. So an example would be to contrast that with someone working in their day-to-day job. They might be a customer service agent and they're really concerned with helping customers sort out complex problems. So an example there could be that if we could help them learn something right now that almost immediately would give them a better outcome and help those customers solve those problems, that's a very different way of learning. So this is learning in the flow of work, and it's this concept of applying learning in the pursuit of meaningful goals. So if we can do that, we take learning out of the classroom and we actually put it into the day-to-day job. It just becomes something we do to get a little bit better every day.
Yeah, and I just want to add to what Peter said, that once leaders at any level, they understand this concept, that will help them to foster learnings within their team. Because let's say there is nothing that stops the leader to ask their team member in their just normal one-to-one conversation, what behavior change are you working on at the moment? In what situations are you demonstrating this behavior? And what kind of objectives do you want to achieve by demonstrating the behavior?
Yeah, that's interesting. That's a nice way of sort of summing that up. So if I understand what you're saying that tapping into that 90%, that sort of 70% on the job and then 20% of support and feedback, if you tap into that 90% of learning, that's one of the keys to speeding up this reskilling in the workforce?
Yeah, absolutely, Caitlin. Yep.
Yep, great. Okay, got it. All right. Well, Stacey, given that example you just gave us, can you also give us some of what you see as the first critical steps that leaders at any level can take to get a little bit closer at developing that learning culture in their team?
Yeah, so what they can do as the very first step is that they need to define the behaviors that sort of underlie the kind of skill that they want their people to develop. So for instance, if I wanted my people to develop coaching ability, it's quite a fuzzy term, so I won't necessarily know what exactly I need to do. But if I go into the specific behavior and say, okay, they need to develop their ability to discuss the link between behaviors and outcomes. And you can see how much clearer and easier that thing behavior sounds. And as you know, at GRIST, we usually call these things micro behaviors. So these are the kind of little steps that are easy to execute, that are observable and therefore accessible. And also what's important, they are predictive of the outcome that you want to achieve. So in this case, if you wanted your leaders to be better coaches, the behavior would be predictive of the outcome. And breaking down the skills into the smaller behaviors that will also help you to ensure that your team knows what good looks like, and it helps them to calibrate. And also it ensures that you can observe and assess their capabilities, and you can also determine what kind of goals and specific micro-behavioral goals they need to strive for and what they need to practice deliberately going forward.
Right, I'll just jump in here. Sorry to butt in, Caitlin. I just had a question come through, and this person's asking, so that idea of just, I guess, learning, for a leader learning to be a good learner, I suppose, just get good at learning to learn. Did that idea come out of any of the research that you saw, Stacey?
Oh, yes, definitely. Not everywhere, but there are some, I would say, influential papers that did mention learning as a key capability going forward. And again, referring back to that World Economic Forum that recently released their report, they placed lifelong learning as in the top 5 skills of the future.
Yeah, right. That's interesting. Learning how to learn. That's definitely something we all need to harness for that. So I'd like to go back a step to the sort of micro behavior concept, this idea of something small that's observable, accessible, predictive of that outcome, and something that a leader or a team member could do. It sounds great in theory. There's something, breaking something down to something little. We know that that's a good way to learn. But we're talking about reskilling across, you know, a broad range of changes, and something that actually has to be done quite quickly. So, Peter, how can something that small make a big difference?
Yeah, that's a really good question. It's counterintuitive, isn't it? We need to do all this change and we need to do it very quickly. So the answer is to break it down into smaller things. That just doesn't seem, you'd be thinking, how does that work? But the theory is based on this concept of aggregation of marginal gains. And that theory really tells us that you're far better to make small changes more frequently than to try and get people to make big changes less frequently. And if you think about that from the way we respond to change, just think about your own experience. If we ask an individual to make a big change, we start to trigger a lot of negative emotions, like, what was I doing wrong before? Will I be able to do it? Will I look like a fool when I try these things? And so we start to get a lot of aversion to actually trying the different things. If you now think about the different approach, which is to really say to someone, hey, you're doing a pretty good job, keep doing everything that you do, but how about you just add this little tiny thing? And it's a tiny thing that can be immediately applied. And as we said with micro behaviors, they're predictive of a good outcome. So if we get them right, they try this one thing, which is not a great effort, and they get a good outcome. Then they start to go, well, wow, I was a bit unsure, but that actually worked. I think I'll give it a go. And once you get people on this roll, then they'll try something else, and then they try something else. Now, all of those little things help, but we think that probably the bigger thing that actually makes the huge impact is the feeling of efficacy and success that comes from those little changes. And then we know that that has this sort of ripple effect on everything else that person is doing in their role, and results in a lift in engagement. And we know that engagement is linked to performance, sometimes regardless of capability. So you get this sort of success being the rising tide that floats all boats, so to speak.
Yeah, that sounds really, really good in theory. And I love the concepts and I love these ideas of breaking it down. But this is putting a lot of emphasis, I guess, on a leader sort of driving these things through their people. And we all know that as leaders, we're pretty busy. Like, it's hard enough to stay on top of the admin and the operational things. So how do you make this happen inside organisations that are already so busy with the operational stuff?
I think the answer in that is the micro behavioural approach. Caitlin. Now, look, I said earlier, ideally this would start from the top. You know, it'd be a full cultural change. We'd redo position descriptions. We'd redo spans of control. You know, we'd have a total look at the organisation. And don't get me wrong, I think organisations are going to need to do that sort of thing in the future to really respond to what's happening here. But let me be really clear, there's nothing to stop an individual leader from doing some small things that would start to foster this sort of learning culture inside their organisation. So in essence, the leader's role is to take responsibility for and act as the conductor of the learning culture. Yeah. Now, you know, leaders, regardless of how busy they are still having conversations with their people. So if we could just make some really micro changes to those conversations, we could start to help with this concept of learning culture. And so, you know, if you think about a leader leading their team, their role is to do everything that Stacey was talking about before, about helping identify the change in behaviour that's actually required and breaking that down as small as they possibly can. But their role is also, you know, to make sure that they're putting in place all of the activities and the conversations that are needed to foster that learning, and the higher frequency they do it, the better. Now, this is a fundamental change to many organisations in the way that leaders act. Most leaders are more concentrated on getting operational tasks done efficiently. But what we're saying is leaders can just to make small changes. And as Stacey gave an example before of some behaviours that a leader could change in their one-on-ones on a fortnightly basis, that little thing would start to help with creating this different culture.
Yeah, that sounds like it's quite a different role for leaders than maybe what they're used to. Peter, could you tell me a little bit about what that would actually look like in practice then?
Yeah, I think the key to this is the discipline that goes around those conversations. Yeah, so that really foster, and what we're seeing in the more successful organisations is they tend to be having higher frequency conversations, but shorter and more impactful conversations. So they're really fostering this notion of incremental learning. So the old concept of a quarterly development conversation, we write an IDP and put it in the bottom drawer, we know that doesn't work. It never worked. So we're really talking about more discipline around having higher frequency conversations that actually make sure that we are acting as that conductor of the learning culture inside our organisations. So things like observation and coaching and team meetings and all those things that you know, help us coach, observe, make sure that we're rewarding people when they do make a change, make sure that we're having team meetings that transferring good learnings across from one person to another. And that all really comes back to a well-defined operating rhythm where leaders are clear about what they need to do. And if you want to go another step further, the really successful organisations are very, very clear about that operating rhythm. And about the quality that's required, and then they actually measure the cadence to that rhythm, and that sort of becomes their promise to their people to help them make the changes that are required.
Yeah, I might jump in. We had a question pretty much that asked what you've just covered there, Peter, is like, you know, where do you find the time? And it sounds like having those short, sharp, frequent conversations and making it, I guess, just part of the system, not just on top of what you already do. That's the basis of your whole plan, I guess.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think, Kate, as Stacey was saying before, and I mentioned as well, if you understand the principle of 70-20-10 and this concept of learning and the incremental gains and the aggregation of marginal gains, you can actually look at what you're doing right now and just make it a little bit better. Yeah, you don't have to do anything new. I'm sure as a leader, no matter how busy you are, you will be having conversations with your team. So if you could just make them align a little bit more with these principles, you will be more effective. Yeah. Now, as I said, it'd be great if we could really turn the whole organisation around with regard to this, but you don't have to. So if you're really under pressure time-wise, just concentrate on using the time you're already putting in, but use it a little bit differently.
And I guess a question from me is, have you seen this kind of learning culture in action and see it really work? Have you got an example where you've witnessed it?
Yes, we had a really good example during COVID. So it was really interesting during COVID was at the start, particularly when a lot of organisations had all their people in the office, and now all of a sudden they had to get them all working from home. You know, one of the biggest upheavals we've ever seen in the way organisations go about their work. And we were hearing lots of requests for, oh my God, we really need some help for us to coach in a hybrid and virtual environment. We need to understand how to coach virtually. But it was really interesting, and change and develop our people. But it was really interesting. There was one of our clients that we weren't hearing any of that from, and they were making the transition really, really quickly, and well, a lot more effortlessly than what we were hearing in other organisations. And it turns out when we really had a look was that those organisations that were asking us to teach them how to coach virtually, they were actually asking us to teach them how to coach because they weren't coaching in the first place. They didn't have a clear rhythm of activities in place. There was no discipline about it. It's just that when it became virtual, it became more apparent that they didn't have what was actually required. Whereas this organisation that was very successful, they'd spent years developing an operating rhythm of really high quality, high frequency learning and development conversations. And all they did was transfer those from face-to-face to virtual. It was all pretty simple. So they were able to make that shift. So that's an example of where a learning culture, we saw it absolutely help an organisation make a transition through one of the biggest upheavals we've ever seen.
Fantastic. Yeah, that's a great example. All right. Haven't seen any more questions come through. Caitlin, do you have any more questions? Or oh no, we've lost Caitlin. All right. Well, look, that's been absolutely fantastic, Stacey and Peter. It's been some really, fantastic insight and some tips there on how organisations and individual leaders can embrace this idea of future skills and start beginning to make those changes as we sort of move into I guess, quite a different way of working and way of operating in the future. So thank you so much for joining us today. And for everyone here, we will email you a recording of today's session along with a PDF download that includes all of the research and the insights that Peter and Stacey have gone through today, and that'll be in your inbox on Monday. So if any of the subject matter has resonated with you, which we absolutely hope that it has, please feel free to share that with your colleagues and to your contacts as well. And if any of you would like to find out a little bit more about how we at GRIST can help you create a continuous learning culture, or have further questions for Peter, Stacey, Caitlin, or myself, please feel free to contact us at any time. The email addresses will be in the email that we send out on Monday, and I'll just share my screen now so you can have a look at those now. Here we are. Fantastic. And on behalf of GRIST, I'd like to thank you for joining us today and being part of this conversation, and we look forward to seeing you at any of our future Hot Topics webinars. Thanks.